He is an economist and the best-selling author of books like Why Your World is About to Get a Whole Lot Smaller, The End of Growth, The Carbon Bubble, and The Expendables. His latest book is billed as a glimpse of a near future that will look very different than the recent past. Here to talk about a map of the new normal, how inflation, war, and sanctions will change your world forever, is Jeff Rubin. Well, the book is called A Map of the New Normal. How did we get here? It seems like COVID-19 was the catalyst for many of the things talked about in the book.
Well, yes. Originally, Penguin Random House approached me to write a book called Is There Light at the End of the Tunnel? And it was really about the economic legacy of the lockdowns, like the work at home movement, which has endured, well beyond any public health rationale. But maybe 3, 4 months into the exercise, events superseded it. Russia invaded Ukraine. The West responded with crippling sanctions, and both myself and my publisher agreed there was a bigger story to write. So hence, Is There Light at the End of the Tunnel morphed into a map of the new normal. I was able to retain a couple of the initial chapters of that book, and it did set the stage. I likened it to a powder keg just waiting to be sparked.
Now, there's a geopolitical dimension to this, which, as you say, has superseded the COVID-19 dimension. Tectonic shift in the existing world order. As you point out, for the first time in many years, the West is angling with opponents who have ample economic resources to fight back. How do the sanctions fit into all of this?
Well, in the words of President Xi and Putin, changes that we haven't seen in 100 years, and I think they're right. The post-war period has been dominated by one global hegemon, the United States, and now there's a new emerging order, and some of the economic heavyweights in the new world economy have aligned themselves with America's principal adversaries, Russia and China, and are calling for changes in the way the world's run. And where these plates collide, you have fissures like Ukraine, like the Taiwan Straits, like Gaza. But actually, the main battlefield isn't even military. The main battlefield is economic. Sanctions, and sanctions are, by any other name, economic warfare. And that's where the war comes home to you. And all you have to do is go in a grocery store or fill up your tank, and you suddenly find yourself on the front lines of that war.
So there's a through line from sanctions to inflation then.
When you sanction the world's top grain exporter, and when you sanction the world's number one energy exporter, there are consequences on the price of substitute supply. And we saw that, food prices at a record high. Brent, the world oil price, went in a triple digit range and may come back. But what's happened with inflation is like a cancer that starts off as a local tumor, but metastasizes and spreads throughout your body. Inflation has started off as a price shock in food and energy prices, but now it has metastasized into wages. Wages are running at like 6% in the US, 5% in Canada. You got to go back decades to see the kind of wage gains. And wages just don't affect the price of food and energy. Wages affect the price of everything.
It's interesting when we talk about this world order coming about because in 1990 people were talking about the end of history, the end of the Cold War. Now we have this new normal emerging, something far different than what we got used to after 1990. What are the implications of these new power blocks?
Well, in their eyes, the beginning of history. I mean, the implications is that the United States and its Western allies are no longer going to be able to use their undisputed military and economic power to unilaterally dictate terms to the rest of the world. Now there's other people there and with very different agendas and very different ideas of how to solve the world's problems. And if you look at BRICS, which has just doubled its membership, but there's a lineup around the block of countries who want to join BRICS, including Mexico. If all of these countries are accepted, BRICS will soon have a GDP much greater than the G7, over half of the world's population, roughly half of the world's oil reserves, two-thirds of the world's natural gas reserves. In short, it will be a power to be reckoned with.
Well, let's define our terms a little bit. So BRICS is basically started out as Brazil, Russia, India, and China. What's it grown to now?
It's now Saudi Arabia, you've got Iran, and it's important to recognize who these countries are. The four fastest growing economies in the last 20 years were in this order: China, Russia, India, Brazil. The fifth fastest was Saudi Arabia, which has just joined BRICS. By comparison, the US economy was the 12th fastest.
So with this emerging power block coming to pass, and then the West in a sort of decline, it's fair to say, productivity wise, how do you think this will turn out?
Well, what's happened is friendshoring has replaced offshoring. And offshoring was the essence of globalization. And don't forget that globalization, we were told, has made everybody better off. But if international trade makes everybody better off, then sanctions make everybody worse off. And that includes you. Friendshoring means trading with your friends, not your enemies, decoupling from China. The problem is that all of America's friends are like us, or Australia, or Western Europe. They're high wage economies. So if all of a sudden, all those things that for decades we relied on the cheap labor of China to provide us with are going to be made at home, that's going to be at a multiple of the cost. Now, the good side of this story is that jobs that we thought were gone forever, you know, those middle class manufacturing jobs that got hollowed out, well, guess what? They're coming back. And so's the middle class. And so are unions. You know, it's almost like a return to the 1960s, because now when workers go on strike, and by the way, strikes are at a record high, the employer can't say, oh, that's fine, we're shutting the factory down and moving production to China where wages are a tenth of your wage. Now that's no longer an option because we can't trade with China anymore. Now employers have to deal with their union's wage demands. And those wage demands are asking for catch up to runaway inflation. So we have in the process the wage price spiral that had made inflation so resilient in the past.
Now, getting back to this idea of offshoring versus friendshoring, one of your observations in the book is how grain may become as important as oil, especially if Russia decides to only do business with its friends.
I think food is a much more powerful weapon for Russia than energy. As Henry Kissinger once quipped, control oil and you control nations, control food and you control people. And it's no coincidence that virtually no countries in Africa condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because they're all singularly dependent on Russian wheat, and Russia just happens to be the world's top wheat exporter. Now, by the same token, guess who the world's second top grain exporter is? Canada. So, you know, we're certainly a beneficiary, but if all of a sudden Russia goes, we're friendshoring, that means we're not shipping grain to countries that we don't like. And, you know, that I would argue that's way more leverage. Like only 2.5 million people in Cairo drive a car. All 20 million eat.
And then where does China fit into all of this when we talk about offshoring and friendshoring?
Well, China is the main target here because we didn't really import much in the way of manufactured goods from Russia. We imported food and energy. But China is the factory of the world, or has been the factory of the world. I mean, China can live without Apple, but can Apple live without China? Let's just say, for example, that all of a sudden Apple can't access its supply chain in China. 95% of iPads and iPhones and Mac computers are made in China. Foxconn, its major supplier there, ironically a Taiwanese firm, pays about $1.50 an hour labor. Let's say all of that got repatriated to Cupertino, California, where Apple's headquartered. The minimum wage in California is $15.50. Do you still think you could afford to buy an iPhone? Is the question I would pose to you.
Doesn't sound like we will. Uh, uh, as we close here, I wonder, are these changes permanent? Do you see any way back to our old normal from this new normal?
No, these changes are permanent. There's no going back to the world we once knew simply because it no longer exists. I mean, the war in Ukraine may be over in 6 months if Donald Trump, wins the election, but sanctions are here to stay because it isn't really about Ukraine. It's about Game of Thrones. It's about, positioning pawns around the world to maximize your geopolitical power and influence. And that's the new normal. And the weapon, the primary weapon, is economic and sanctions. And that's where it brings it all home to you.
This is going to take a lot of people by surprise because a lot of folks, if they're not paying attention, they still think that the world operates as it did in the globalization era of the 1990s, of the Clinton administration.
Of
But
course, it's operated that way for 40 years. But I think, with every passing day, just last week, President Biden announced, crippling tariffs on batteries made in China, and China will respond. It's getting easier to recognize that this is a very different world and different kind of economy than the economy we knew before COVID.
a map of the new normal, how inflation, war, and sanctions will change your world forever, is published by Alan Lane. My thanks to author Jeff Rubin.
My pleasure.